everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss again. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today we're going to talk about book reviews. And not the type of book reviews that Paul Gray used to write, that we talked about a couple weeks ago for Time Magazine, that introduced books to the sort of popular audience. We're going to talk about academic reviews, the bane of every academic's existence. And to do that, I wanted to talk about one of the most famous reviews ever written of an academic book, and it was published in this, the Quarterly Review, in 1860. And we recently got a copy of this Quarterly Review to come in. Normally journals and reviews are not things that people say, but this was one that was worth saving because it was an anonymous review published in 1860, if you look in here, on Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Now, at the time this review was anonymous, people didn't know who wrote it, but it was actually written and revealed later to be written by a man by the name of Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam, a bishop in the Anglican Church, and he did not like Darwin's theory one bit. In fact, it culminates, and it's a very long review, it goes on for tens of thousands of words, but culminates in this basic argument, which is, and he does the normal niceties of saying Darwin is a good writer, he's making an interesting case, he has lots of interesting things to say, but we can explain all this. We don't need natural selection. We don't need evolution. We can explain all this. Why? Well, we can explain all this by the simplest and yet the most comprehensive answer, by declaring the stupendous fact that all creation is the transcript in matter of ideas eternally existing in the mind of the Most High. That's right. That was all that was needed. Now, interestingly, we know that Darwin read this review because he had a copy of the Quarterly Review. And do you know what he wrote in the margin right there when Wilberforce was talking about the mind of the Most High? He wrote, mere words, mere words. So we also know he wrote the review because he corresponded with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Huxley. And Thomas Huxley was outraged by this review, and they played sort of guess the author. Originally they thought it was somebody else, but Huxley basically said, how on earth could the reviewer basically call you, Darwin, a flighty person who endeavors to prop up his utterly rotten fabric of guess and speculation, and whose mode of dealing with nature is reprobated, is utterly dishonorable to natural science. Huxley was very, very upset. Darwin said, you know what, I don't have a lot of time to spend with reviews. I've got my research to do. But Huxley took up the fight. And what's really interesting is that Huxley bumped into Wilberforce when the two of them were at Oxford. And again, this is before he knew that Wilberforce had written that review. And a famous exchange is had at Oxford in which Wilberforce turns to Huxley and says to Huxley, are you descended by apes on your grandfather's side or your grandmother's side? And Huxley says to Wilberforce, well, I'd rather be descended from an ape than somebody like you. And that was reported in all the newspapers at the time. So that's the original reception of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species. If we go back 30 years to the 1830s, the most famous scientist in all of England was a scientist by the name of Michael Faraday. And he's famous for inventing words like ion and cathode and all things having to do with electrolysis, electricity, ventilation, you name it. And he worked at an institution called the Royal Institution, which was basically a big social club for scientists in England. And even Faraday, though, had his critics. And at one point, he did the rather small thing of simply changing out all the lights in the reading room, in the public spaces at the Royal Institution, from oil lamps to gas lamps. And boy, did that cause a stir among all the old fuddy-duddies who were on the board. In fact, they were so upset that they wrote Faraday a series of questions. And they printed it in a letter. And they basically said, why has oil been displaced by gas in the public rooms of the Royal Institution? And then they asked him all sorts of gotcha questions like, well, what is the ratio of light from an oil and a gas burner? And what's the ratio of heat? And all these things. Well, Faraday was not deterred. He patiently answered all the questions, and he said things, well, like oil is not as good to burn as gas because gas burns at a rate of 21 to 13 in terms of being brighter. Gas is brighter than oil. And in terms of heat, gas is 3 to 2 in terms of generates more heat. And he goes on and he talks about ventilation and why all these things are necessary for the Royal Institution. And then, as the final answer to his reviews from the old fuddy-duddies, he mails it to each of them. And this is actually folded and sent as a letter so that they can learn a little bit about science. Interestingly enough, he basically, they were all complaining that they liked the light from the oil lamps better, but he was saying, if we don't get better ventilation in here, we're going to have a fire or we're going to have an explosion. And Faraday is famous because he investigated sort of the disasters of this Victorian period, including a huge explosion in a coal mine in England, which he was the first to attribute to the fact that there were dust particles, coal particles in the air. And he developed a ventilation system which nobody really paid any attention to in the 19th century, but is now a standard part of mining today. So Michael Faraday dealing with his reviewers and writing his response, Charles Darwin writing his response. Well, we're going to end today with a funny book, and I've got to say it's about time that we start making some fun of 1940s and 1950s advertising. And here is a fantastic book, Getting the Most Out of Your Lathe. And I think what I like most about this book is that, of course, the gentleman's smoking a pipe. That you would not see today. But his lathe is in the middle of their living room, and his patient spouse is, of course, cleaning everything up and beautifying it with flowers. And what's also particularly interesting about this is that it is advertising for you to buy the whole series of these. And if we had a whole bunch of them, you'd see that they're all these sort of comical plays on spheres of domesticity of the day, but they're all arguing that these are rare volumes, that you need to preserve them, you need to have them bound, and we will sell you all of these bindings, all of these for just $3.75 a volume, a complete set of everything ever published for just $10. Getting the most out of your lathe, today's funny book. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week for another edition of Buy Day Friday.